What's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Brook. Welcome back to another Crafted Workshop video. I am super excited to bring you guys today's video. This is a project I've been designing and working on for quite some time. The build only took me probably 4 days, but I've been working on the design for a while. And so this is my new kind of assembly table, outfeed table, T-track table, workbench, whatever you want to call it. Basically, it's going to live right next to my table saw, and this is kind of the center of my shop. So this is going to see use every single day. You might remember I had the Polk workbench here previously. It had some features that I didn't really need and that kind of got in my way. So kind of went back to the drawing board and designed something that was going to be perfect for me. This tabletop is roughly 73 by 42 inches. So it's got a ton of space. Obviously the big feature here is all of this Rockler T-track. This is going to allow me to do so much with work holding, fixturing, just keeping things in place and helping me work more efficiently and more effectively. They've obviously got tons of accessories for their T-track system, these auto adjusting clamps, their bench cookies, these new vacuum pods, which are vacuum clamps, which I'm really excited to try those out. But the cool thing about this Rockler T-track is it also works with other T-track accessories, like the ones from Woodpeckers. This fence is from Woodpeckers, and Incra. This is the Incra hold down. So really versatile top. I can do all kinds of stuff with this and am really excited to have that dialed in. But in addition to the top, I've got tons of storage down below. I've got room for about 9 Systainers. It depends on the size of Systainer you have, but obviously I'm a big Festool fan and want to continue to expand my collection, but storing them can be a bit tricky, and having them all stacked up means that if you need to get at the one at the very bottom, that's kind of a pain. So that's why I added this Systainer storage. I can slide out these trays, access what's inside the Systainer very easily, and then just close it up. And if I ever do need to take them with me, they obviously come out of the trays super easily. In addition to the Systainer trays, I have 7 drawers on the front of the table, along with a hose reel for using all of my air tools, and 2 screw storage containers that will allow me to organize my screws a lot better. So overall, this thing is just awesome. It's massive. It's a bit monolithic, but I just love it. I think it's going to last me for years to come, and hopefully you guys are excited like I am. So this is a bit of a long video, but hopefully you guys enjoy it. And without further ado, let's go ahead and dig right into the project. I started this project by breaking down the sheets of Pure Bond plywood into the pieces for the assembly table. For this build, you'll need 5 sheets of 3/4 inch plywood, along with 1 sheet each of 1/2 inch and 1/4 inch plywood. To break down the sheets, I used a combination of my track saw, table saw, and miter saw. You definitely could build this project using a circular saw, but it'd be pretty tough to get super accurate cuts. The 3/4 inch plywood will be used for the main cabinet carcasses for the assembly table base, and the tabletop is also made out of 2 pieces of 3/4 inch plywood glued together. When cutting the pieces for the tabletop to size, I cut 1 piece to its final dimension, and then added a 1/4 inch to the length and height for the second piece. That way, when gluing the pieces together, I could make sure there was an overhang on all 4 edges, so that I could then route the edges flush later. I assembled the tabletop with the work surface facing down and added glue and 1 inch brad nails through the bottom of the tabletop to hold it in place while the glue dried. While the tabletop dried, I continued breaking down the pieces for the assembly table base. As I went, I made sure to number my pieces based on the parts from my cut list so that I could easily grab the correct pieces when it was time for assembly later on. Once all the parts were cut to size, I started drilling the pocket holes which will be used to join the pieces together. I started by drilling pocket holes into the cross support pieces that will connect the 2 walls of the Systainer cabinet carcasses. I made sure to offset these holes since there will be a cross support piece on either side of the center cabinet divider, and the screws would run into each other otherwise. After drilling the holes into the cross supports, I added pocket holes to the back edge of the cabinet sides as well as the center divider, and these holes will be used to attach the cabinet back to the sides. Next, I started assembling the Systainer cabinets. First, I attached the cross support pieces in each corner, making sure to orient the pocket holes so that the spacing was consistent. I added glue and 2 1 1/4 inch screws per corner, and I made 2 of these assemblies for each Systainer cabinet. Next, I added the center divider onto one of the assemblies, again adding glue and screws. With the 2 assemblies complete, I then attached the 2 halves to each other. You can see here why the pocket holes in the cross supports needed to be offset. Otherwise, the screws would have run into each other in the center divider. When using pocket holes, it's really important to clamp everything in place before driving the screws. Otherwise, your parts will want to slip around on you and will most likely end up misaligned. To finish the assembly of the Systainer cabinet, I attached the back panel using the pocket holes I drilled previously, and make sure to check for square at this point, as things will be permanent after attaching the back cabinet with glue and screws. And here's the finished Systainer cabinet. There are 2 of these cabinets, 1 on each side of the table, so repeat these steps to build a second identical cabinet. Next, I moved on to building the center cabinet, which attaches the 2 Systainer cabinets and forms the center of the assembly table. And you can kind of see here how all the pieces come together. First, I attached the bottom panel to the 2 Systainer cabinets, and then drilled pocket holes in the center divider and back panel. Next, I attached the center divider to the bottom panel, using the cross support pieces as spacers to make sure the divider was centered properly. I also made sure the front of the divider was flush with the front of the bottom panel at this point. Once again, the center divider is attached to the cabinet sides with these cross support pieces, and again, make sure the pocket holes are offset at the center divider so that they don't run into each other. Next, I attached the back panel to the bottom panel along with the center divider to finalize its placement before attaching the back panel to the cabinet sides. And if any of this is a little bit confusing to you, I do have plans available for this build that are a lot easier to follow. It's kind of difficult to get shots inside the cabinet while it's being assembled, so sorry if it's confusing at all. And with that done, the cabinet assembly is done. Once the glue dried, I added these Rockler leveling feet to each corner of the assembly table base, and also added a few more feet to the center back section of the base. In addition to the leveling feet, I also added these Rockler Workbench casters to the assembly table, and I wanted to be able to move this table when necessary, but I wanted it to be rock solid the rest of the time. And these casters are kind of perfect for that application, since the workbench will be resting on the leveling feet when the casters aren't engaged. With the shell of the table base done and mobilized, I moved on to working on the drawers. And the drawers are really simple. They're just made of 1/2-inch plywood for the drawer box sides, 1/4-inch plywood for the drawer bottoms, and 3/4-inch plywood for the drawer fronts. And I like to keep drawers for shop furniture really simple, no rabbits or dados or anything like that just add complexity to the build. So first, I glued and brad nailed the sides together, making sure to keep everything nice and flush. And next, I flipped the drawer over and added brad nails to hold the bottom to the sides. This also locks the drawer into square, so make sure to check for square before adding the brad nails to the bottom. With the drawer temporarily assembled with brad nails, I came back with 1 1/4 screws, added 2 screws per corner and 8 screws on the bottom. This makes for a really strong drawer, and you don't lose any drawer capacity like you would with the drawer bottom housed in a groove. Next, I installed the drawers into the cabinet, and this has not traditionally been my favorite task in the shop, since it's usually really repetitive and pretty finicky. But that said, I got one of these Rockler drawer slide jigs, and it definitely makes the process a little easier. To install the other half of the slide onto the drawer, I marked the location of the slide on the sides of the drawer, centering it on the drawer, and next I attached the slide with 3 screws. To install the drawer into the cabinet, I just pulled the slides out and slid the drawer into place. And the drawer needs to be pushed pretty firmly to lock the slide in place on the first time, but then it's good to go. I just kept repeating this process until I had all my drawers installed. While I'm installing the rest of the slides, let's talk about one of the sponsors of this week's project, Rockler Woodworking and Hardware. I used a ton of Rockler products during this build, including their T-Track system, drawer slide jig, workbench casters, drawer slides. Pretty much all the hardware for this build came from Rockler, and I'll have links to all the items I used in the video description below. Rockler's got tons of great tools and accessories for your next build, and they're always coming up with new and innovative ideas to help make your woodworking more efficient and more enjoyable. Thanks again to Rockler for sponsoring this build. Also, I got to feeling a little artsy during this build, and decided I'd try my hand at some stop motion a la Frank Howarth. Well, this is how far I got before I got tired of it and moved on. In case you missed that 1.5 second clip, let's watch it again at half speed. I definitely have a lot more respect for folks like Frank after giving stop motion a shot. That 1 second clip took me about 10 minutes of work. I cannot imagine how long some of Frank's videos take. Anyway, with the drawers installed, I moved on to building and installing the Systainer trays. These Systainer trays are based on a design by the Poplar Shop, and I'll have a link to his video in the video description below. They're really simple to make, just a piece of 3/4-inch plywood for the bottom and 1/2-inch plywood for the sides. The bottom is attached to the sides with 1-inch pocket screws. After drilling all the pocket holes, I assembled the tray, making sure to clamp my pieces in place along the way. Installing these trays was basically the same as installing the drawers, except I did run into one small issue when going to install the slides. I failed to account for the bolts from the caster plates when coming up with my tray spacing, so I had to rearrange things slightly to make it work. If I were to do this over again, I'd probably glue and screw a block to the outside of the cabinet and use lag screws instead of the through bolts included with the caster plates. With all the drawer slides behind me, I moved on to adding a few other accessories to the assembly table base, the first of which was an air hose reel. I thought it'd be pretty awesome to have the compressor there and have a hose reel connected to the compressor through the back of the cabinet so that I always have air accessible while I'm working. This hose reel has 50 feet of hose, so it should easily reach anywhere in my shop. And I'll also use one of the drawers below the reel to store my air tools and other air accessories. Another big part of the assembly table was effective storage for screws. My current drawer is a total mess with zero organization, and since all the screws are in boxes, I can never tell when I'm running low just by looking in the drawer. I found some of these screw storage boxes and figured it'd be easy to build a little area to house them, similar to what Adam Savage has with his Sortimo boxes. These boxes are a whole lot cheaper than Sortimo boxes and have pretty much all the same features, so to install them into the cabinet, I just added little plywood rails, but forgot that I was supposed to build them out of 1/2-inch plywood instead of 3/4-inch plywood. I just went back and planed the 2 strips down, but you should just make them out of 1/2-inch plywood, and that's what the plans call for. The last pieces that added the base were the drawer fronts, which were simple enough to install. I cut a few spacer strips from scrap plywood and clamped the drawer fronts in place while adding a few screws from the inside of the drawers. I cut an 1/8-inch thick strip to space the drawer fronts from one another and just worked my way up until I had all the drawer fronts installed. With basically all the parts of the base installed, I moved on to the tabletop. First, I wrestled the top up onto the base, which wasn't that easy considering how heavy this thing was. And once the top was in place, I centered it on the base, leaving 2 inches of overhang on either end and 3 inches of overhang on the front. I fastened the top to the base using 1.5-inch screws from below, and it's important to use screws that are short enough so that the T-tracks won't be blocked later on, hence the 1.5-inch screw length. Now that the top was secured in place, I could get to work on it. First, I routed the edges of the work surface flush with the bottom piece using a flush trim bit on my router, and you can see how the edges end up perfectly flush with this method, something that would have been really difficult to achieve if you tried lining up the 2 pieces during the glue up. Next, I needed to add some trim to protect the edges of the tabletop. I used some hard maple that I had on hand, but you could just as easily buy 1x2s from your local home center instead. I jointed one edge on the board and then ripped a few strips from the board at just over 3/4 of an inch thick. After ripping the strips to rough thickness, I planed them to their final thickness of 3/4 of an inch, and this also removes any of the burning left by the table saw. Next, I jointed one edge at the jointer and then ripped the trim to its final width of 1 5/8 of an inch at the table saw. To install the trim, I took a measurement from the table and then cut the piece to length at the miter saw. I then added glue to the inside face of the trim and attached it using 1.25-inch brad nails. I made sure to leave the trim a little proud on the top so that I could sand it flush later. Speaking of which, after the glue dried, I sanded the trim flush using 80 grit sandpaper. While I'm sanding, let's talk about the other sponsor of this week's video, PureBond Plywood. I really love using PureBond. It's a formaldehyde-free hardwood plywood that's made in the USA, actually right down the road from me here in North Carolina, and it's super high quality. Basically, anytime I'm using plywood on a project, especially for furniture, I'm using PureBond. It's available exclusively at Home Depot, and I'll have a link in the video description below if you'd like to learn more. After sanding, I added a roundover to the edges of the trim using an 1/8-inch radius roundover bit on my trim router. And with everything installed on the tabletop, it was time to route the grooves for the T-tracks. All right, so I'm getting set up for one of the more important operations in this whole build, and that is routing the grooves for these Rockler T-tracks into the assembly table top. So I've got my router set up with an edge guide, and I've got a 3/4-inch straight bit in the router. And so basically this T-track is 3/4 of an inch wide by 3/8 of an inch thick. So I'm gonna be routing a 3/8 inch deep groove into this top. So the first tracks I'm going to install are the ones along the edges. So I've got one along the front edge and one along each side. So basically I'm gonna set up my edge guide and center my router bit at 3 3/8 of an inch. And that way, this front edge of the track is 3 inches from the front of the tabletop. And I think that's gonna be a really ideal spacing. So let me go ahead and finish setting this up and we'll get to routing. Once the depth was set on the router, I went ahead and routed the first groove. I ended up routing all the grooves in one pass, but it probably would have been a little better to route them in 2 passes, although I was left with a really clean groove, even going to full depth on the first pass. I did forget to add a sacrificial board to either end of the groove on this first pass, and this resulted in a little bit of blowout at either end of the groove. After this first pass, I did a test fit of the T-track and it was fitting pretty snug, so I decided to take a second pass just to widen the groove slightly, and this made the fit snug but manageable. Here you can see me routing the second groove on one of the sides of the tabletop, and you can see how I installed this sacrificial block that I added just using some double-sided tape, and this completely eliminated any blowout I got. With the 2 sides done, it was time to route the grooves in the center of the tabletop. All right, so I got the first 3 grooves routed in. That went pretty smoothly. And so now, since I can't use the edge guide because it's too far in, I'm using a straight edge. This is just an offcut of a piece of plywood. Once again, I marked in to the center of where I want my track to be, lined up the center line on the router with that at both ends, and then just kind of verified square. Everything seems to be good to go and ready to route. So one other little tip when you're routing, if you have a flat edge on your router and you're gonna be riding it up against kind of a reference edge like this piece of plywood, don't use the flat edge, use the round edge, because as you can see with the round edge, the bit stays in place no matter what angle I'm at. So if I'm having to reach across a tabletop like this, doesn't really matter. Whereas if I was with a flat edge, if I go off at all, that's gonna change the positioning of my bit. So let's go ahead and get these grooves routed in. On my first pass using the plywood as the straight edge, I didn't account for the flex towards the center of the plywood strip, and this left me with a slightly sloppy groove. Not the end of the world, but not something I wanted to repeat. So on the second groove, I added double stick tape to the center of the plywood strip, and you can see how cleanly the T-track fits in the groove by eliminating the flex in the plywood. The last 2 grooves in the tabletop were along the short length of the top, so I could use my track saw track as my straight edge, and this was a lot easier since it's completely stiff and didn't need any tape added. With all the grooves routed in, I sanded the tabletop up to 120 grit and broke any sharp edges on the base, and then I could apply a few coats of finish. I used General Finishes high performance water-based polyurethane on this and sprayed it on using my HVLP system. I really only applied finish to help protect the top from glue and other finishes, but I figured I'd add finish to the base while I was at it. The last step in the build was to install the T-track into the grooves in the tabletop. And this was a pretty straightforward process, especially since I got these intersection kits from Rockler. You certainly could make these yourself at a regular T-track by cutting the angles on the miter saw, but these intersection kits make things a lot simpler. To install all the T-track pieces, I pre-drilled holes and drove in number 6 screws. The screws are included with the intersections but aren't included with the regular T-track section, so just keep that in mind, and I went with 1-inch long screws. To cut the T-track sections to length to fit between the intersections, first I measured each piece individually since the measurements will vary slightly based on the intersection placement. And to cut the pieces, I just used my miter saw. Aluminum is a really soft metal, and the miter saw cuts it extremely easily and leaves a nice clean cut. Once the piece was cut to length, I pounded the T-track flush with a dead blow mallet, and then pre-drilled the holes and drove in a few screws. One other thing I wish I'd had during this T-track installation was a self-centering drill bit. Drilling the holes would have been a lot faster if I didn't have to worry about trying to perfectly center the holes in the T-track to keep it from shifting around while driving the screws. And once all the T-track sections were installed, the assembly table was finally done. All right, hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. I am just so excited about this, as you already know. This thing came together beautifully. I could not have planned it better, honestly. There were a lot of happy accidents that just kind of worked out. Again, I do have plans available for this project if you want to build one of these for yourself. It's a bit of an expensive build, I know, but you could obviously adjust this to fit your budget, depending on how much of the T-track you add, what kind of accessories you add, what kind of plywood you use, all that kind of stuff. I love it. I think it's going to be an awesome addition to my space, and obviously you guys will see me using this constantly coming up. Thanks again for watching, everybody. If you don't already, go ahead and get subscribed. I put out new project videos like this just about every week. Also, I have a list of all the tools and materials I used in the video description below, so before you ask, go check there. And last, I want to say a huge shout out to all my Patreon supporters. There is a Patreon tier to get access to all my plans, and this assembly table will be included there, so now is a great time to join up. All right, thanks again for watching, everybody, and until next time, happy building.